Okay. My name is Carl Grusho. I'm from the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. I'm on the call with Amanda Vasquez. We're both research analysts. She's acting in the managing role. I'm the primary investigator, and we'll get into the role of the VOCA administrator in a bit. We're only from the SAC at the moment. So our project is examining underserved victims in Illinois. And what we're looking at doing is integrating service provider perspectives with statewide data. And we'll get into what that actually means in the next few slides. So, okay, the overall goal of our project is we're trying to kind of combine qualitative and quantitative data together to put together a functional working definition of what underserved means in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault victims in Illinois. That's useful for statistical understanding, but also on-the-ground administration at providers, as well as for grant administration, possibly for future grant prioritization in terms of having specifically worded items when they apply for grants. In practical terms, we have 4 more specific goals. The first is to create a definition for underserved that has both VOCA administrator and provider buy-in. Implicit in that is that it's informed by the underlying statistical data. To that end, a large part of the project is creating an atlas of statistical evidence on the actual demographics of help receiving victims with local populations and incidence rates. I'll get into this in the next slide about what this actually means, but atlas is somewhat literal in terms of it means actual maps. So the third part here that we're trying to do, and this is where the actual funding is going to help us in terms of this specific grant, is in taking the opportunity to meet with service providers and the VOCA administrator in the same room as sort of a focus group session, 2 parts of them, and to solicit their input and their intake to kind of get them to engage with the data and interact with it so we can actually revise both the format and the specific analyses in a way that they find more compelling and persuasive. This is getting a bit to some of Brad's points about how to get the buy-in. We kind of have built a situation where we can have them tell us what makes sense, what doesn't, because a lot of the data that we're looking at is collected by them. So then we can get them to tell us the limitations to it, what they do and do not find plausible, et cetera. And the final part of it is to formulate policy recommendations that are both informed by the actual input from what the on-the-ground perspectives are, as well as the statistical data. So next slide is kind of a summary of the quantitative methods. This is an ongoing project. So a little bit of background. The first point on the left, when we say big data, which is a term I don't like, but kind of applies here. In Illinois, we have a system called InfoNet. This is a statewide database of DV and domestic violence and sexual assault service utilization throughout the state. It basically includes demographics and service records for about 80% of the victims and 100% of the victims who receive, 80% of the help receiving victims, I should say, and 100% of the VOCA or VAWA funded service receiving victims throughout the state of Illinois, dating back to 1997. So it's a pretty great resource. It has not been utilized very much for sort of analytic research. It's been used for sort of trends and service data, but not for sort of digging into what we can learn about DV. So what we're doing is we're trying to build a model of victims in Illinois, who's receiving services, who's reporting to the police, to some extent infer what the likely overlap may or may not be from those groups, informed by the population and natural crime victimization study, get some sense of what the likely incidence rate is to sort of do a by region estimation of how many victims of what demographics are likely to live in certain areas at certain times, what percentage of them based on the actual police reports are reporting, and what percentage are seeking services. So that's the very ambitious gist. To talk through a little bit of our methodology without getting too far in the weeds, on the right-hand side is actually probably not the final format, but very much, I think, the final analysis of one of the sort of slides in the atlas, which is race ethnicity of DV help receiving, DV is missing on this slide, compared to random sampled local population for 2014 to 2018. So what this is showing is if we sort of take a statistical assumption that the actual people who received help were a random sample from the people who lived in a specific area, how far apart is that distribution from what we've actually seen? And that allows us to construct, without getting into specifics, that allows us to construct confidence intervals for whether each specific demographic group in our data is or is not likely to be a random sample from that location. And the color coding is actually a categorical coding with a little bit of semantic, sense. So typically black is sort of the orange hue, yellow is Latino, Asian is kind of a green color, white is somewhat blue. But it gives you a sense that typically what we're seeing across the state is that actually Black and Latinx populations are overrepresented amongst help receiving victims, whereas white and actually Asian populations are underrepresented compared to random sampling. Now, I don't want to, it's very important, and one of the things we want to talk to the providers about is that just because you're statistically overrepresented does not necessarily mean you're not underserved. Some definitions of underserved on the ground are very likely to incorporate concepts of need and other resources that might be available to you, which we logically can't capture. But in terms of visualizing what VOCA services are doing in the state, this seems like a pretty good start. And we'll have these going back to about 2009. Right up to more or less the present, like 2019. 2020 is too early, but some of them might be a little 2020. And other data sources that we're doing similar analyses include the police data. So we have the case level data that is the underlying data for the UCR statistics for Illinois, and marginally good locations for those in the downstate area. In the Chicago area, we actually have very precise locations for most of those. So we'll be able to compare within a certain zip code, essentially, very real numbers for how many DV police reports there were with how many help cases there were, or help receiving victims there were, and compare them with the population. So this is a pretty complicated methodology. And we're very sympathetic to that, which is why we're trying to use maps to try to make it as much on the ground and visual and practical to service providers as we can. And then we want to really be able to talk with our service providers about, does this mean anything to them? What are their actual on the ground experiences? So we're going to have two different focus groups, two different tracks, DV and SA handled separately. And we're going to speak with them at length about their experiences serving underserved victims generally, or reaching out to them, as well as their thoughts on the data. I mean, from my past experience already, having up in ICJIF for more than about 1.5 years now, every time you can find some rule about how data is entered, the effect that has on the data is always larger than any sociological trend you might identify. So it's critical to talk to our providers about it, so that they can say, oh, that's probably just because whatever data entry rules we might be following. To give a little sense of what the design is, we're going to have two sessions. The first session is more about general understanding before looking at the data and interpretation of the data. The second session is going to come about a month to 5-6 weeks later. It's going to be reviewing a revised presentation of the data, as well as the feedback and lessons learned or message gathered from the first focus group. And it's also going to incorporate the VOCA administrator as participants in the second session to sort of help co-construct policy recommendations and examine cost and benefit issues. the points are actually meant to reflect the sort of order of questions that we're going to talk about in the focus groups. So the first session, the first half of it is actually going to be ignoring the data that I showed. While I find the data very compelling, I imagine many of our service providers may not. To them, that's not how they think about their work. They think about their work as individuals and their communities on the ground. And I kind of am going to, to the extent possible, want to be soliciting their actual experiences first to see if it's giving me a completely different picture or not from what the data says. So expected outcomes, we of course expect to be able to come up with a working definition for underserved that could be applied in Illinois. In working on this, I've actually read it is literally in the VOCA-SAC for VOCA, one of the responsibilities is VOCA administrators have the ability to define what underserved means in the context. Looking around, mostly that's just drawing from national guidelines. And at least in Illinois, I don't see it being driven by the data, but we have a lot of data, so we're going to try to build some and also get a reality check from our service providers about, first of all, what does that, is that definition that we get from the data at all matching with what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis? What would the impact be of trying to change up policies or outreach efforts that you're making or funding streams perchance? Would that have a negative impact on people who are already being served, et cetera? Finally, policy recommendations that could be more concrete, which may or may not fall within actual funding streams, but could just be practices amongst the service providers as well that they think that they could adapt to either record better who's being underserved or better address the needs of those who are underserved. Status of this, we have our IRB in the sort of exemption hold period, 10 business days. We should be able to recruit right around April 30th or May 1st. We'll be sending out recruitment letters. The quantitative work is already well underway. It's ongoing. We're a little bit behind schedule because we're under stay-at-home order for about a month now. So right now we essentially have the Infonet to American Community Survey analysis complete, and I'm working on adapting the NCVS rates that are published to fit ACS and Infonet, and possibly coming up with possibly accessing some more raw data to reconstruct them to match in the time frame, because NCVS rates are usually published in 1-year time frame, and we're primarily looking at sort of overlapping 5-year windows. So that's where we're at right now. Impact of COVID-19, we had an abrupt switch to remote work that lost us about a week. Focus groups are going to have to be remote, so that's one thing we're dealing with right a bit. It slowed down the IRB a bit, because we had to look at realistically what could we do. We're trying to figure out how to best run focus groups remotely. We'd actually seen a real selling point of this is getting face-to-face interactions. We have pretty good relationships with our service providers because they are our users of the Infonet system. So I especially frequently have contact with their data analysts on their staff, et cetera, about various interests that they have in learning and using our data. So I kind of have a sense of who is likely to participate, or at least what organizations, but it was almost a selling point for them, I think, to be able to come on site and have face-to-face discussions about these. I'm worried about it translate it into a remote format. So that's essentially what it is. And I think that may lead to a potential recruitment issue as well. And this is just our timeline. Overall timeline's fine, but we are a couple weeks behind, basically just because the processes had to be rewritten to how to do certain things remotely and get data access, et cetera. And that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions right now.
Thank you, Carl. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to chime in verbally, or you can put them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you, whatever you're comfortable with. Andrew, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, great presentation. This is Andrew from Alaska. In your outcomes section, you mentioned how you might recommend a better record of who is underserved at the practitioner level. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, okay, this is one of the reasons why we don't have the VOCA administrator on the call, is because they are participants. So I'll give a little sense of what the data seems to be telling me that I'm not planning to disclose to the participants beforehand. One thing that I'm seeing, if we go to our quantitative data here, is oftentimes our definitions of underserved are resource-oriented, which I think is appropriate, and also victimization rate, at least by many estimates. But what I'm seeing in some areas is rural whites that you can't see it in this visualization, but there's certain, like rural whites may just be receiving services at a lower rate due to proximity of services or difficulty accessing them. There's some evidence for that in some places in the state, but also you have situations in some of the urban areas, Chicago especially, but also some of the medium-sized cities, where there's an Asian or Latino community that is in very close proximity to a service provider, but you don't see them reflected much at all in some numbers. And interestingly, there might be a difference between DV and SA. So oftentimes I think our service providers, and this is pure speculation in part, but just in terms of what we're interested in terms of research questions and what we've seen in the data so far, so huge grain of salt. I think sometimes some of the, I guess we might say emerging populations that have become more prominent within Illinois in the past 2 decades, really, different Asian populations, literally meaning different Asian populations, East Asian population, South Asian population, also the MENA population have grown, and we're seeing different representation of those in different areas. So I think getting a more nuanced definition that gives awareness that underserved does just not necessarily mean minority per se, but in a specific region, there may be a specific minority who may or may not be receiving services. Is that getting it? I'm trying to not be too specific because I do strongly believe in not over-interpreting my data, but you know, this map, if you look at it closely, seems to be indicating that some of that might be going on. Does that answer the question?
It does, thank you.